Hello and welcome to Pod Save the King, episode 2 of our history category of our podcast. So we'd just like to thank listeners and the wide range of support we received from our last 3 episodes published. We could have never imagined that we'd reach 209 downloads of our podcast. It's more than we could have ever imagined. So we'd firstly like to thank, the 4 continents that are listening to us at the moment. We'd like to thank listeners from the UK, the USA, Germany, Switzerland, Australia, Brazil, and I hope we're not missing any. But if we are, then we hope that we've done you well, and we hope you enjoy it. So we'll give you a brief summary of today's episode. So we'd like you to enjoy our discussion of how modern day Christmas came to be, as we discuss Prince Albert and the Victorian impact on the festive season, the Christmas truce in World War I between Germany and the Allies on the Western Front, and the gifted Christmas tree each year that Norway gift to England for their support in World War II. So, Auntie Ellison, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So, our Christmas as we know it now, I think probably we can link it back, certainly, a modern type of Christmas, if we can put it like that, to Victorian times. And I believe it was Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, that brought the tradition, or started the tradition of a Christmas tree.
He did, yeah.
And did he bring them from Germany?
Yeah, I think he did, yeah. He brought them from his home in Germany. And he brought 9 Christmas trees over for Buckingham Palace, one for each of the 9 children of him and Queen Victoria. And I believe they were decorated with candles and
sweets.
Sweets and, I think, orange skins, I think.
Yeah.
I think it's crazy how, and it shows the impacts of, the royal family, even from, more than 100 years ago on today, and how the tradition that Prince Albert has brought over has, impacted our modern day Christmas.
And it remains. It remains
exactly,
very part and front and centre in most homes is the Christmas tree.
Definitely.
If you don't do anything else, then people tend to signify it, Christmas, by the tree.
Yeah.
Big, small, real or artificial, don't they? And there's lots of other things that came about at that time, and I believe Christmas crackers and gifting became more towards the Christmas part of the Christmas period rather than at New Year.
Yeah, because before, obviously, this kind of Victorian idea of Christmas came about, gift giving was fairly common, but it was centred more around, the New Year. So I think the fact it was brought through to Christmas, and that has kind of stuck even to today, the gift giving is, other than the Christmas tree, the main kind of symbol of the Christmas period. I think that shows how big of an impact Prince Albert did have.
Absolutely. And the gift giving, I think, in some ways, has overtaken that tradition towards religion as well, and what it was all about. But we'll save that for another time. So just thinking about the food, we have spoken about this in the previous cast, about food traditions associated with Christmas.
Yeah. So, for example, obviously, I'm sure the main part of everybody's Christmas table is the turkey taking place in the centre. And that also did originate from the Victorian era. Poorer families would tend to use cheaper birds, such as ducks and other similar things. But the turkey for most Christmas tables, what was the bird to eat.
Yeah. I would suggest that Christmas dinner is the most important meal in the year.
I could agree with that, yeah.
It really is, because everybody will know this from all the countless adverts that we see about how to make your Christmas easier, but I think also it signifies a time for feasting feasting in its wider sense, that you consume more calories than you do for the rest of the year, because all the adverts that you see are these tables absolutely laden with food that feed the whole of the streets,
absolutely,
not
yeah.
just one family. But we were thinking about the historical context of Christmas and what was happening around the time of Victoria. And of course, it was an incredibly productive time because of the Industrial Revolution, Empress of India, the empire was expanding. Britannia really did rule the waves at that time.
Absolutely, yeah. And I suppose, whilst, Christmas is a happy time, especially in Victorian England, we can link it to, terrible conditions in the factories, terrible conditions for many people working in the colonies. And I suppose, especially, mainly for people in Britain, Christmas kind of, every terrible and awful thought and pain that they'd go through day to day was kind of put to one side, and they focused on Christmas. Families gathered, rich and poor. They made the best out of the situation. And we were speaking earlier about how that links to Charles Dickens' novel A Christmas Carol. Would you like to speak a bit about that?
Yeah, so I think we can safely say that Charles Dickens was drawing on his, not necessarily his experience, but certainly his observation of society at that time, and it was a society of the haves and the have-nots, and some people would argue that that's still true today, but I think the have-nots in them days really were the have-nots, and I think he was drawing on a bit of social history and context about, the poor really were poor and the rich were really rich. And we were just having a look earlier on. So Christmas Carol was published on the 19th of December 1843. Very timely, published in December. And in just a year later, and maybe because of Charles Dickens, we don't know, there was a further Factories Act in 1844 that brought in more health and safety measures in factories. Do you think Charles Dickens had such a impact on society? He certainly was promoting
I think
benevolence.
The novel of A Christmas Carol, obviously it would be sold and richer people would buy it, wouldn't they? And the kind of ultimatum that it gave the main character Scrooge, change your ways or you will live in a life of sin and ultimately be punished with the worst punishment religion has to offer, hell. I think when the more capitalistic side of society actually read that, they thought they could compare themselves to what Scrooge was doing. Hang on a minute, I'm also doing that. Yeah. I'm also treating people in this way. Maybe it's wrong for me to do it. So I think in that way, it probably did, even though we have no evidence to suggest that it did. We can only kind of think about it. Yeah, exactly. We can only acknowledge that could have had an impact, and it is likely to have had an impact because it raises awareness. And the same way in modern day, social media posts, influence what legislation is passed in current government. Charles Dickens' novels probably really did. And I think it's interesting, A Christmas Carol, because he does draw upon personal experiences. I studied A Christmas Carol for my English literature GCSE. And Charles Dickens was from a poor family.
Was he?
Yeah, so his dad they lived in a debtor's prison. They were very poor. His first job, his first proper job, he was 12, and for a shoe polish company. And the fumes of the shoe polish, he hated it. It was his worst ever job. So Charles Dickens writing, and it was very rare for people to climb out of the social bracket.
Absolutely.
It was very difficult.
Yeah.
So for Charles Dickens to do that and then stick to stick to his idea of making things better for the poor, really, really is interesting, especially from a modern perspective. And for Charles Dickens as well, it's important to remember, obviously this was over 100 years ago, so he wasn't a socialist. He didn't want equality. He called upon benevolent capitalism. So for people that don't know of benevolent capitalism, it's, the rich giving things to the poor, helping them. Rather than making it equal, all he asked for was for the rich to just give a little bit more to charity. Which isn't unreasonable, but obviously to a very, very capitalistic society in the Victorian era, you can imagine how that went down with a few business owners.
Yeah, that's very interesting, that, because I hadn't realised that his beginnings were so humble. I guess at the time that he was writing it, as you quite rightly said, he was drawing on his own personal experience.
Yeah.
Even though he was probably quite accomplished and comfortable at the time of writing.
Yeah.
But it makes me wonder, doesn't it, that I think there probably was at that time beginning to be an awareness of the imbalance in society, and the fact that rich people were being, the consciences were being pricked to act differently. And also, no, at that time, religion was so much stronger than it is now.
Definitely, yeah.
I'd be putting my hand in my pocket if I thought I was going to hell.
Yeah, definitely.
And maybe not all purely for benevolent reasons, but for purely selfish reasons as well.
And yeah, A Christmas Carol is a really interesting topic, and it links really well to the Christmas in the Victorian era. Not only just because of, you know, the things that Charles Dickens raised awareness of, you know, for the poor and stuff, but also because, for example, like the characters in the novel A Christmas Carol, and it was made into a film by Disney. It's available on Disney Plus. It really kind of, the characters truly represent the stages of society. So obviously Scrooge, we know, represents, you know, the capitalist 5% that owned most of the wealth.
And look after yourself, it's your own responsibility.
Well, exactly, yeah. Now, there's a character called Fred, which is Scrooge's nephew, and he represents this kind of middle, well-off part of society, but not necessarily very rich, but obviously much better off than the people at the bottom. And then, if you're aware of the novel, the Cratchit family, they represent, you know, the very, very bottom of society, the lowest of the low.
Not quite.
Well, no, because there is the vagrant class, I suppose.
Yeah. And those indebted to prison, because at least he was working, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was working, and he had a job. But, you know, they did represent the working class.
Yeah, very much so.
Like we say, the vagrant class, obviously, these were, you know, thieves, you know, should I say...
Unemployed,
women that worked out on the night, should you call it. When they had no other alternative, they had to put food in the children's mouths.
Because there wasn't any national assistance at that time, was there?
No, not at all.
So if you hit on hard times through no fault of your own, it was tough luck.
Yeah, and I mean... So a famous quote, Scrooge says, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? And then the charity collectors say, well, some people would rather die than, you know, use them things. And then Scrooge replies, one of the most famous, if not the most famous, well, if they would rather die, then they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population.
Yeah.
Now, that's awful.
Well,
and it's even more awful because I myself come from a working class background. I mean, 100 years ago, I would be in the same position as the Cratchit family. I would probably be cleaning out machinery and sweeping chimneys. It's awful because... And Scrooge's opinions on the poor at that time really do represent what people thought. You know, the fact that you couldn't feed yourself meant that you was a strain on society. It's quite unbelievable from our 21st century mind to comprehend that vision. Now, you know, completely moving on. I mean, we have got to cut it short, but we would like to talk about the World War I Christmas truce. So we touched on Christmas adverts in our PodSafe Society, which is available at the time this will be uploaded. So please do go and check that out. But so the World War I Christmas truce. Now, if you don't know what the World War I Christmas truce is, a really good kind of way to visualise it, Sainsbury's in 2014 released a Christmas advert which was surrounding the World War I Christmas truce, were Germans and like the German soldiers and British and French soldiers unofficially kind of truced and came out of the trenches. They exchanged names, photos, souvenirs, food, and it ended with arguably the most famous image of the Christmas truce with a friendly game of football on the Western Front. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think for me personally, this is one of the saddest moments in history. Just for me personally, there are many more events that are equal, if not worse. I'm saying that. But just for me personally, it really touches my emotion, because in such terrible, terrible conditions, in terrible, terrible circumstances, these poor men on both sides are being forced to fight each other. And then Christmas comes along and they have this unofficial truce. I suppose that shows the power of Christmas, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely.
But it's so sad that it's very difficult to put into words, but it just seems the most saddest moment ever, that people so easily can come together and be friendly with each other. And there was also exchange of prisoners going on during this period of truce. And then they have the game of football, and then when the Christmas day was over, they went back to fighting each other. And to me, that is so, so sad. And we were just having a look into a bit more depth. And following that occurred in 1914, the unofficial truces were declined significantly because they were really frowned upon by the commanding officers.
Yeah.
They were probably frightened of people saying, that's it, I'm off, and going AWOL.
The article that we read, the commanders actually by 1916 they banned trucing. So by 1916's Christmas, they were unable to truce. They wasn't allowed, even if they wanted to. And I find that really sad that ordinary men, people my age, I mean, I'm 16 now, people my age were forced to kill people that they didn't want to kill. It was kill or be killed.
Yeah.
And it's just awful. And I think the fact that they could stop it for Christmas just shows that they could have stopped. And the war, like they said many times, the war could have been over for Christmas.
Yeah.
If the men in power would have allowed it. I mean, it is really sad, like you say.
Yeah, I think you'd spoken before about, was it General Haig? I might have got the name wrong.
General Haig, yeah.
He sent troops over the top into no man's land to be mowed down.
Yeah, to be massacred. It was.
And then when there was what I understood was
this for context. This was 1960 in the Battle of the Somme, so it's not related to the Christmas truce, but it will come into it.
Yeah. So my understanding was there was a big offensive by the Allies, and they bombed the enemy, in inverted commas, for about 3 days, and thought, that's it. They're all gone. They're all dead. We'll go over the top. And actually, they'd made barricades, hadn't they?
Yeah, underground concrete bunkers.
So as the Allied soldiers went over the top, they were just mowed down.
Yeah.
Now, you would hope that any commanding officer or general would have thought, that has not worked, so we'll do something different. But he didn't.
No, he didn't.
And he's just sent more and more and more. And I suppose there are parallels to that in Russia. Did you see just recently there's a hotline been set up for Russian soldiers that want to defect? I don't think that's quite the right word, but I'm thinking of, but want to surrender.
Right, okay. Yeah.
So it's terrible that people are forced into these situations.
Definitely, yeah.
By above.
Yeah. Which if you'd like to know more about the Battle of the Somme, you can find it on, our website. We speak about it in Pod Save History, episode 1, when we speak about, remembrance and war. So, unfortunately, we can't talk too much into the Christmas truce because we do have to move on. And we're now going to talk about Norway's gift of the Christmas tree to Britain for Britain's support of them in World War II. So, do you want to start on that, Annie Olsen?
Yeah, certainly. So this came about because I think Norway was one of the neutral countries in the Second World War. I will look that up afterwards, but I'm pretty certain it was. And I think the Allies, and particularly Britain, provided a lot of support in the Second World War. And the king was exiled because of the threat of Nazi Germany. And he was... he had a place of safety in Britain, and resulting from that, since that time, Norway's gifted a Christmas tree every year that stands in Trafalgar Square.
Yeah, and I find that really interesting because so the tree gifted it's quite difficult to actually transport and fairly expensive to transport, and the fact that Britain's work in World War II is still recognised this day year on year, a real testament to the men and women that worked in World War II to secure our safety.
Yeah. And the fact that Norway's never forgot that.
Exactly. Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure many of them generations will be long gone now.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's a real testament to the people of Britain.
I think there are other examples, actually, just thinking about it. I think Malta, I think they received a lot of support in the Second World War from the Allies, in particular Britain. And I think Britons are always really welcomed in Malta for the support. And I'm sure there's other examples that we're not even aware of, but it is quite a symbolic...
Yeah, definitely. In the same way that Britain is, one of the leading countries in assisting Ukraine during the war. Yeah. I mean, we've always... Obviously, in some cases we have had a very dark past, but in many more cases we've had a very welcoming past. A past where we do help many people, and I think that's a forgotten part of British history. Many people, I'm sure, focus on kind of the negatives and the atrocities that our ancestors may have committed, but in fact it's important to remember that we weren't the villains all of the time. We was very welcoming, we was very good in assisting other countries.
Yeah, and I think you raise a really important point there, because you have to see history in its context. So things that was acceptable when I was a child are no longer accepted, and if we go back in history, whether it was right or whether it was wrong, it was legal at that time.
Yeah.
So, yes, we did do things wrong. And certainly, when you look back, you can see it through a very single lens.
Yeah.
Where it's... Because we're applying our principles today to principles that are so different in the past.
And by all means, we're not suggesting that we should, look back on Britain's history through rose-tinted spectacles. But then what we're saying is, don't look at Britain's history through a magnifying glass that makes it look like hell. Do you know what I mean? I think as historians, it's our job to have a balanced opinion, no matter which country or which person we're analysing. We've got to analyse both sides of a story.
Yeah. And
the Christmas tree gift from Norway just proves that we're not all bad.
No, and I think the Christmas Carol. I think one thing it does show is that every single person has an impact on so many different lives. So now that Scrooge changes his ways and becomes more benevolent, he has a positive impact on Tiny Tim, doesn't he? Because Tiny Tim lives and thrives.
I think the book describes Scrooge as a second father to Tiny Tim.
Yeah, he does.
But it just shows that, we, as well as historical figures having an impact, we have an impact. We can...
Every single person has an impact.
Anything that we do day to day can change the course of history, whether that's positive or negative. So it's important that we spread the message, If you truly believe in something that is right and just, go for it. Make it heard. Make that impact be known. Because you could be the next historical figure that, two people in 100 years are talking about on a podcast. You know what I mean? And it's very important.
And even if you're not, you in your life come in contact with so many people that you can have a positive impact, leave a positive footprint without actually having done anything fantastic in your life or what society would describe as being fantastic. But just by having human contact with each other, you can have a really positive impact.
And on that note, we wish you a Merry Christmas from our family to yours. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast today, and we'd like to let you know that you can email us with any opinions you have on the topics we've discussed today at podsavetheking22@gmail.com. You can message us on Instagram at pod.save.thing. If you would like to go to our website, you can visit us at https://podsavetheking.buzzsprout.com. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and many more. So your favourite podcast app, you can listen to us on any of them. So that's a goodbye from me.
And it's a very happy Christmas from me and all the best for 2023.
See you in the new year.